Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our opening event this evening. My name is John Bodell. I'm one of the three co-directors of the program in Early Cultures, and on behalf of my co-directors, Steve Houston and Sue Alcock, who's regrettably unable to be here this weekend, I'd like to welcome you to this opening event of our fourth and, for this year, final workshop in our Animal Magnetism series. We have a special event tonight, a bit unusual for an academic conference, but we're taking advantage of the opportunity we have of timing and location to hear a presentation this evening by a fairly recently formed group. The Jencks Society for Lost Museums was formed at Brown in the spring of 2013, just a year ago, by a group of Brown and Rhode Island School of Design students and professors who had learned, thanks to my colleague Steve Lubar in the front row, of the existence at one time in this very building of a museum of natural history that had been dissipated and lost over the years. And this group decided it would be in the interest of the history of the location, the history of cultural heritage, the history of Brown University, to revive the memory of this event and the institution that once stood in this place. And so with the help of Mark Dion, an artist and professor of visual art at Columbia University, they're preparing an exhibition to be mounted in this building, reflecting more than trying historically, I think, exactly to recover the history of the event, but they'll tell us more about that. The exhibition, I think, is scheduled to open on May 1st, but they've agreed to come and give us a little bit of an advance hint of it tonight. And without further ado, let me introduce Jessica Polinsky, who I think will be introducing her colleagues, to tell us a bit about the animals of Rhode Island Hall, the collected stories of J.W.P. Jenks. Jessica.
The three of us are Jencks Society Fellows. This is Rebecca Souls and Lily Benedict, and we're going to be in our presentation now.
Good evening. We are fellows of the Jencks Society for Lost Museums. Let us begin.
On September 26, 1894, Professor John Whipple Potter Jenks dropped dead on the steps of Rhode Island Hall.
He was in his 76th year, apparently hale and hearty, his youthful enthusiasm not abated. He had lunched, perhaps too heavily, with some dear friends, with one of whom he had walked up College Hill, stopped for a minute in conversation on the steps of Rhode Island Hall, started to go up the stairs to the museum, sank down, and expired without a moment's sickness or suffering. One could not ask for a finer end.
Who was Jenks? For the last 23 years of his life, Jenks had served as the curator of a natural history museum at Brown, which he had founded, and in which he died. An 1838 graduate of the college, Jenks served as teacher for many years. Upon retiring in 1871, Jenks wrote to Brown's then president, Alexis Caswell, expressing his concern that Brown did not have any sort of natural history museum.
While Brown is one of the oldest institutions in the country, there is one hardly half as old that has not better facilities for illustrating as any branch of natural science, and I am positively ashamed for my alma mater.
In addition to his duty, his devoted service as curator of the museum, Jenks also taught classes in zoology and mentored a group of young student taxidermists, including Dallas Lord Sharp of the class of 1895.
Here in the museum, I lived and studied and worked afternoons and evenings with the old naturalist. I would set us a simple lunch over the small gas stove by the sink, and then at night he and I would go out for dinner together, especially when there was a job to finish, some bird or beast to mount, and returning, we would work and talk the evening away. And here, as we worked, the old naturalist would talk, wiring the delicate bones of some small skeleton together, or flipping the feathers of some bird into shape, while his stories of turtle eggs and panthers and snakes and alligators, of men and of the ends of the earth went on.
Though Jenks was a self-proclaimed naturalist, he devoted much of his life to the field of education. Before returning to his alma mater, Jenks served as principal of Pierce Academy in Middleborough, Massachusetts. Even at Brown, Jenks acted as professor of agricultural zoology and gave taxidermy lessons to interested students. It was in this capacity as teacher that Jenks made the acquaintance of a 17-year-old Dallas Lord Sharp. Professor Jenks had donated a large selection of birds and animals, shells and specimens to the South Jersey Institute, where an eager and enthusiastic Sharp was charged with unpacking the collection. As an avid fan of the great naturalists of the day, Sharp was in awe of Jenks. Recollecting the moment of their meeting later in life, Sharp wrote, "If anything of the heroic was lacking in Jenks' appearance, it was more than made up by that shuffle caused by arsenical poisoning. Arsenic in his very bones, a martyr to science." Upon working together for some hours, Jenks exclaimed to Dallas, "You ought to have a lesson in skinning and mounting. Run out into the grove and get me a bird." Sharp tracked a cuckoo and brought it back to Jenks, remarking, "This is the only bad bird I could find." But Professor Jenks protested, "No, not a bad bird, but a very useful one, and I shall prove it when I open the gizzard and show you how stuck full it is of caterpillar hairs." Meanwhile, Jenks deftly cut into the bird, removed the gizzard, and turned it inside out to display the lining stuffed with thousands of caterpillar hairs. According to Sharp, only a wizard could have foretold that mystery. Only X-ray eyes have seen through that body wall and beheld the plush-like coating of woolly bear caterpillar hairs. So that is what it is to be a naturalist, a scientist, to know the cuckoo's languid shape, its dreamy call, and the bird's very place in the scheme of creation. Wisdom indeed, hidden from ordinary mortals. Sharp cites this lesson as the reason he eventually applied to Brown University, where he would live in Jenks' office and workshop in the museum.
Despite Jenks' desire to create a scientific natural history museum befitting the university, some of the collections acquired for the museum clearly catered to the interests of the general public. In addition to Jenks' taxidermy apprentices and other Brown students, one might see the occasional visitor from Providence wandering through the museum. One of the attractions that drew the interest of the public was a small Shetland pony, scarcely 3 feet in height, with shaggy red hair, placed in a position of honor in the center case of the museum. Reputed to have belonged to Queen Victoria of England, acquiring the pony for the museum proved quite a challenge for museum curator Jenks. Although Jenks and his students were avid taxidermists, the facilities at the museum were not equipped for taxiderming large animals. On February 19, 1876, he wrote to Henry Augustus Ward, a fellow naturalist and taxidermist. "I called upon Mr. Pierce this afternoon. He is unwilling to do more than to contribute the pony to me to do with what I please with. Now, I want terribly bad for both the stuffed pony and the skeleton pony, but as yet the college still owes me for both the horse and buffalo, and I cannot raise a nickel." Funding the museum was a perennial problem for Jenks, and he received only limited assistance from the university. Instead, he decided to send the live pony up to Ward in Rochester, New York, with hopes that he would be able to buy both the mount and the skeleton at a later date. "If I pay you nothing, both and all are yours to do with what you please. It is a genuine Shetland, such as I have never seen except in Victoria's equestrian and in the Shetland Islands. A magnificent fellow, I assure you, about 17 years old, a perfect horse." 2 weeks later, Jenks discovered that he could not ship the live pony all the way to Ward. "Instead, I went 2 miles into the country this afternoon, cut the jugular of the pony, and let it bleed to death. Boxed it up, put it aboard a freight car for Rochester via Worcester, Albany, etc., nailing your cards upon the box." Jenks did eventually get the stuffed pony back from Ward for display in his museum. Featured in 1893 in an article about the museum written by the Providence Journal, it was noted that, after being brought over from England, the pony was for nearly 15 years on a farm in East Providence, where it died a quiet death in peaceful old age. With changing sensibilities, the story of the pony's acquisition changed as well.
Jenks's approach to natural history was religiously motivated. He wrote in his textbook, 14 Weeks in Zoology, "Man, the lord of the animal kingdom, is constructed after the same type as the cat that purrs at his feet, the ox that he eats, the horse that bears his burden, the bird that sings in his gilded cage, the snake that crawls hissing across his pathway, the toad that hides in his garden, and the fish that swims in his aquarium. All are modifications of one creative thought, showing how the almighty worker delights in repeating the same chord with infinite variations. In Jenks's biotheological worldview, every species was created for a particular purpose in a particular environment, and there was much emphasis on how animals were designed for harmony with their surroundings. To study nature was to gain insight into the mind and intentions of the almighty creator. In that same textbook, we find the passage about the hippopotamus. The hippopotamus of Africa is semi-aquatic, with horizontally projecting lower incisors and strong vertical canines. A greedy feeder, it sinks to the bed of the sluggish stream, where it can remain 6 or 8 minutes, digs up a quantity of aquatic vegetation, rises to the top, and, washing the mass, devours it while leisurely floating on the surface. It is exactly fitted to dredge the rivers and keep open the channels, so apt to become filled with the luxuriant growth in that tropical region. Not all of Jenks's students shared his worldview, many of them embracing the dreaded theories of Darwin. As evolutionary theory was changing the study of biology, some of Jenks's students and colleagues began to find him old-fashioned. The following story was recollected in a biography of Jenks's student, Herman Carey Bumpus. Professor Jenks, representing as it were the end of an epoch, clung tenaciously to the ideals of the philosophy of special creation. Bumpus was appointed an assistant in the museum because of his skills in sketching animals and mounting specimens. He was able to help in the revision and illustration of many of Jenks's scientific writings. In revising one of his books on zoology, Jenks particularly cautioned his assistant to retain his statement on the use of the hippopotamus. It is exactly fitted to dredge the rivers and keep open the channels. The whimsical Bumpus countered with the query, shall I say the beaver was exactly fitted to dam up the rivers of North America?
In 1855, several decades before arriving at Brown to start his Museum of Natural History, Jenks showed his mettle as a field naturalist unafraid to face the rigors in the pursuit of science. One spring morning, Louis Agassiz, the eventual founder of the Museum of Comparative Zoology at Harvard, turned up on the doorstep of Pierce Academy with an unusual request of the school's principal. I was busy one day with my classes when a large man suddenly filled the doorway of the room, smiled to all 4 corners of the room, and called out in a big, quick voice that he was Professor Agassiz. Would I get him some turtle eggs, he called. Yes, I would. And would I get them to Cambridge within 3 hours of the time they were late? Yes, I would. For the next month, Jenks established a routine as he carefully monitored the local turtle population. A little before dawn, along around 3 o'clock, I would drive over to the pond, hitch my horse nearby, settle myself quietly among the thick cedars, close to the sandy shore, and there I would wait, my kettle of sand ready for the eggs. My eye covering the whole sleeping pond. Here among the cedars, I would eat my breakfast, and then get back in good season to open the academy for the morning session. It took patience and determination to wait for the eggs to hatch. Finally, the time had arrived. This was the day. I knew it. That we have extra senses, I fully believe, and I believe they can be sharpened by cultivation. For a month, I had been watching, brooding over this pond, and now I knew. I felt a stirring of the pulse of things that the cold-hearted turtles could no more escape than could the clods and I. Crawling through brambles and mud on his hands and knees, carefully tracking the turtles until they laid their eggs in the soft sandy soil, Jenks eventually filled his kettle full for Agassiz. Now he had 3 hours to get them to Cambridge. Unfortunately, the turtles had not timed their egg laying to correspond with the Sunday train schedule. By a dint of luck, Jenks neared the station on his horse just as a freight train was passing through. Abruptly leaping aboard the train, Jenks must have been quite a sight for the engineers. I caught enough of their broken talk to understand that they were driving under a full head of steam with the intention of handing me over to the Boston police as perhaps the easiest way of disposing of me. avoiding the fate of being turned over to the police as a lunatic by slipping off the train before it arrived in the freight yard. Jenks soon arrived on Agassiz' doorstep. After being roused out of bed by Jenks' knocking, Agassiz cried, "Let him in! Let him in! I know him. He has my turtle eggs."
And now we have a special guest, our Professor Steve Lubar, to talk about the robin.
Thank you very much. We start with a poem written by the 8-year-old Louisa May Alcott in 1840. It's called "Oh, the First Robin." Welcome, welcome, little stranger. Fear no harm and fear no danger. We are glad to see you here, for you sing, sweet spring is near. Now the white snow melts away. Now the flowers blossom gay. Now, dear bird, come, dear bird, and build your nest. For see, we love our robin best. So, 1840, Louisa May Alcott, age 8, writes and says to the robin, "Fear no harm and fear no danger." So the question, of course, is what was the harm, what was the danger to the robins in 1840? So this brings us to a moment of the strange world of New England of the 1840s, the world of ritual bird murder in New England countryside. In 1820, just about the time that Mr. Jenks was born, it was common to have the custom every year on election day to the farmers to go out and kill the birds. It was formerly the custom, Mr. Jenks wrote, to have a shooting match on election day in May. On such an occasion in North Bridgewater in about the year 1820, a great many birds were killed, so many that a man bought a cartload of them for the purpose of enriching his land. It turns out there was an enormous debate going on in New England about whether or not birds should be killed. Jenks was on the side of the birds, as was Louisa May Alcott, and he was going to prove that, in fact, these birds were not doing any harm. The laws were changing at this time. There were some fines were in place. There was constant attempts to get rid of the fines for killing birds. And at the Horticultural Society of Boston, which Jenks was a member in 1858, the society said, "We want to eliminate the laws that protect these robins, protect the birds." Jenks said, "No, science will tell us the answer." So he did the sort of science that he was best at, which turns out to involve killing a great many robins. He said he would lead a fact-finding mission for this Horticultural Society to learn the habits of the robin before the Horticultural Society should take a stance on this controversial issue. Here's what he said he would do. First, to obtain birds at daybreak, midday, and sunset. Second, to obtain birds from both the village and the country. Third, to preserve in alcohol the contents of each gizzard. From March to December, every day, he and his students at his school obtained birds. Roughly, let's say 600, 900 birds killed to check what's in their gizzards. He decided that what he learned was quite decisive. The birds, in fact, were not eating the seeds of the farmers. They were actually, like the cuckoo in the earlier story, they were eating the insects that would have been eating the seeds. And he used he wrote a report, the Horticultural Society published it, and decided not to try to get this law overturned. Thank you.
Jenks was very much a man of his time. To our modern sensibility, his love of nature and his willingness to slaughter hundreds of animals as scientific specimens seems contradictory, but Jenks saw no such contradiction. To him, the study of animals required an intimate knowledge of them which could only be achieved through the capture, dissection, and preservation of their bodies. We now invite you to consider with us how these stories from the life of John Whipple Potter Jenks capture different aspects of the relationship between man and nature in the 19th century, as the practice of natural history was giving way to the modern science of biology. We would love to hear your thoughts or answer any questions. Thank you.
love the story of Dallas-Lord Shark and the cuckoo. I think it's great. Do we still have any of these taxidermied animals around? I'd love to see a cuckoo.
We, as the Jenks Society, are reconstructing what is left of the Jenks collection. We do have a few bird specimens from the Jencks Museum, not necessarily cuckoo. I think we have an olive-backed wood thrush. So no cuckoos, but birds that Jenks did taxidermy will be in our installation.
Can you tell us something about what happened to the collection eventually?
Sure. So the Jencks Museum was in existence here in Rhode Island Hall from 1871 when Jenks founded it until 1915. The last few decades of it, it was in decline. Jenks died in 1894, and after he died, the museum began its decline. First of all, a number of more forward-thinking professors of biology were more interested in using the specimens for dissection or getting rid of them for laboratory space, so the museum began to be slowly dismantled. Then there was a fire in the building in 1906 which destroyed many collections, and in 1915 the biology department got a new, more modern laboratory building that was larger and able to accommodate a much larger number of students than this building, which was quite outdated at the time. And so they moved into the new building, packed all of the objects up into storage, put them in various closets and attics around Brown. Natural history specimens don't do very well stored in closets and attics, and they decay pretty quickly. So they began to decay. In 1945, the then chairman of the biology department decided that he had had enough of filling up his closets in the building with all of these things, so he transferred them to the university dump down by the river. And a number of things kind of slipped through the cracks and are still around, and we've been tracking those down.
Thank you.
So you spoke a little bit about, you told a number of stories from his students who had these amazing interactions with their professor, and it seemed like he was teaching at a particular point in time where you mentioned Darwin and his views on evolution and biology and things like that. Do we know anything of his academic legacy? Were his students going on to become great naturalists, great forward-thinking naturalists, or was he sort of forgotten as a teacher? It seems like he had a major influence on his students.
I think so. I think perhaps his greatest influence is his student Bumpus, who got rid of the museum, perhaps did no longer believe what Jenks believed about biology, but left Brown in 1901 to go become the first director of the American Museum of Natural History. And that may be one of his most profound legacies. The other legacy is in popular science writing with Dallas-Lord Sharp. He was a writer, wrote that piece that they read was from the Atlantic. He wrote widely and so I think that he had a very large influence, at least through those two schools. I think his science, though, was out of fashion by the time.
So I heard you talk on another occasion as well, and I've read some of the things on your website, and to hear you speak, it sounds like you've been emotionally affected by Jenks' story, that his passion seems to sort of kindle passion in others, and I'm curious if that has taken you to a place where your attitudes toward what count as intimacy with animals have changed. Do you want to take up taxidermy all of a sudden? And has it changed your personal attitudes at all?
Do you want to answer?
You can answer if you don't.
Okay. I think it has definitely affected us in a lot of ways. We spent quite a fair amount of time on this project. We've talked about hosting taxidermy workshops. We have one artist working with us who does vegan taxidermy, which is very interesting, and she's talked about doing vegan taxidermy workshops. And I think it's safe to say that most of us would not have considered a taxidermy class prior to learning about Jenks. So definitely some changes.
I think as a lot of us are also very interested in museums in general, I think it's also changed the way we view museum objects and what does it mean to be temporary or permanent. That's what we really want to get into with our installation.
if you've had any thoughts at all or any contact with the Nature Lab right down the street in terms of your interest in, you know, how it might have looked or storage or how people use it, you know, because the first year VISD class, I think we all draw in there, right? So just curious.
We do have some, we've had some connection with them, and a number of us actually in the project are also sort of connected with the Nature Lab in different ways. So the Nature Lab was founded later in 1937, and there are certainly some similarities. One main similarity being that both of them are set up so that all of their collections are on display. There isn't any division between display and collection storage as there is in most museums. Clearly there's a big difference in the way the objects are meant to be used. So those are meant for inspiration, for design and to draw, rather than obviously as sort of biological teaching collections. But it definitely is a really interesting parallel, particularly because it's fairly interesting that RISD has a biological collection and Brown, in fact, does not, although Brown has a biology department. And it's interesting to compare the difference in sort of the collections material at RISD, which actually has a lot of emphasis on teaching collections. They have the museum, they have the Nature Lab, they have the materials library, whereas Brown seems to have a bit less of that.
Art, would you be interested in speculating some more about the temporary versus permanent idea that you just raised? I think it strikes me as a really interesting, I agree, it's a very interesting case in point. So related questions are, what does make, is a museum, how permanent is any museum? Are some more or less permanent, and does their permanence or less temporariness have to do with their relationship to a particular moment in the development of science, the history of science, or does it have something to do with their relationship to a certain cultural moment, or just go on some more? It's a really, I think, sort of topic.
It's a fascinating question. I should start off by saying we're running a symposium next year on exactly this topic of lost museums. What we've found as we've looked into museums is that while the rhetoric is all about permanence, in fact, museums are not really as permanent as they like to think they are, and the collections within museums are not as permanent as they like to think they are. For an audience of archaeologists here, I like to talk about museum tapophony. You know, museum collections disappear, and if you actually go back and look, say, at the Smithsonian's Natural History Museums, connect collections of what they had in 1850 and how much of those are left today, a large percentage has disappeared. Ideas have changed about what should be saved. These ideas have changed about transfer between museums. For instance, the Jencks Museum had lots of Smithsonian collections. Smithsonian sent collections all over the country to small museums. That was just part of what they did all the time. They traded collections around the world. And then museums go out of business when they lose fashion. Art, when they go out of fashion. Art museums less so. But there were commercial museums, there were dime museums, there were Barnum-style museums, and those have all disappeared, and most of their collections have disappeared too. So, as an advertisement, next year, probably next spring, symposium on exactly this topic.
I guess I want to ask a similar sort of question, or just invite you to say more about that, but specifically about natural history, because I mean, everything that you've done today is really fascinating, and I appreciate not just the content, but also the delicacy of the tone in some ways, because tonally it's a difficult kind of project, and also the fascination with it involves a certain number of number of levels of discomfort in a sense. But I guess the question is I guess I have two little questions. One of them has to do with natural history as a kind of discourse that today one sees folding back on itself, by which I mean that a lot of museums of natural history have started to talk about their objects, the history of their objects in a sense, and the history of the slow decay of these objects, because a lot of museums today actually tell you the age of their collections and try to sort of account for the apparent sort of deterioration of these objects. So there's a way in which this is really specific to natural history, not just, I mean, more specifically than the museum. It is loss as a principle of natural historical objects that's really interesting here. And sorry, and the second question has to do with the even deeper level of this, which is the animal, right? As in, there's a connection between the expiry built into the method of natural history and the extinction of animals. Which is a strange kind of, it's a complicated connection, but some museums are also starting to have to talk about that. The French Jardin des Plantes Museum actually has a room of disappeared species, right, which is taxidermied specimens of animals that you cannot see anymore in reality. So there's those vanishing points are just built into the whole context, which makes your choice of object particularly fascinating.
So to your first question, I think you're absolutely right. There's much more emphasis and awareness in natural history museums of treating their collections as historic objects and showing them as this was a moment in time. I can say that having worked in a natural history museum for a number of years, you get a lot of very upset children asking you why you killed all those animals. And that sense is more and more common, I think, leading natural history museum curators and educators to have to feel like they need to explain this in a historical context a bit more, because our ideas are completely different than the context out of which it grew. So that's absolutely, I have seen that phenomenon, and it is pretty interesting. The point about extinction also, this is another really interesting question, how natural history museums deal with that. You know, on the one hand, we can draw the connection between this willingness to kill all of these animals and the extinction of the animals. And then on the other hand, natural history museums realize that when you have extinct animals in your collections, this is the only place in which they exist, and this is an amazing resource. And people are talking about, you know, reviving extinct species using genetic material in museum specimens. So it's a pretty interesting question and problem.
It's clear that this very rich and thought-provoking presentation has stirred up a number of issues which we hope to continue discussing in the next day and 36 hours. But let me suggest that this would be a good time for us to call a pause to the formal questioning, and we could all adjourn outside to a modest reception where, with our speakers' permission, thanks again to the Jencks Society, we can continue peppering them with questions about this fascinating topic. Would you join me in thanking the Jencks Society once again?